and Development, and also has several professional publications in her field. So she's well qualified to teach this course. This is her third session, so we have really put her to work. Feel free to go ahead and ask questions throughout the presentation. And for any of you who missed the presentations in regards to counter-staff training, if you would like to take those, they will be recorded and made available. So it was very informative this morning and yesterday, and those resources will be available for you as well. Today's session will be recorded also. So without further ado, Robin.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I know it's hard to do this right after lunch. Everybody, if we were in Mexico or somewhere or in the islands, we'd be having our siesta right now or whatever. But thank you so much for coming in. Hopefully you'll learn something or we'll share information that's mutually beneficial in the next period of time that we're together. Obviously, we're here because it's important to understand and look at the issues of making sure that we are inclusive of employees with disabilities in the workplace. And we have employees with disabilities now. You may not know you have employees with disabilities, but statistically it would tell you that you do because about 1 in 5 of every American has some form of a disability. And so we know that there is disability, but oftentimes disability is invisible. It's not seen by us. And many people have disabilities and they don't need accommodations, so they may never have come forward asking for accommodations, so they're not making it known to you that they actually have a disability. So our intent with today is to just really talk about some of the major issues around employment and people with disabilities and make sure that you're aware of the forms and the process that's available and in place here at Champaign County related to our employees who might have disabilities requesting a reasonable accommodation. So let's just start with some facts. There's about 53 million Americans have disabilities, about 19% of the population. So again, that 1 in 5 number comes into play. 40% are over the age of 65, and the percentages increase drastically as you go up. So each one of us, as we age, the chance of becoming disabled or having a disabling condition increases, which is just logical when you think about the aging process itself. And about 32% of Americans with disabilities at the age of 18 to 64 are working, which is very low compared to the percentage of people without disabilities that are working. There's a huge proportion of people with disabilities who wish that they were working or would like to work, but struggle still getting into the workplace. And there's a lot of complexities that go into that particular issue. Pass a law like the ADA or any kind of law that mandates non-discrimination on any group and suddenly believe that it's going to change drastically the landscape of society. There's a lot of reasons and issues why people aren't in the workplace who have disabilities, especially older persons who haven't had the education, haven't had the training, haven't had the opportunities, don't have the soft skills necessary to work in the workplace. So there's a lot of things that go into that. Our systems here in the state of Illinois are dismal at best. For helping people with disabilities in the employment arena. I also serve as the chairperson of the Governor's Task Force on Employment of Persons with Disabilities here in Illinois, and I can tell you firsthand how poor our systems are that are supposed to be there to help people, whether they're federally funded or not, but we just don't do a good job compared to some of our states or our counterpart states. So we've got issues for sure. As of December of 2015, the labor force participation, if you look at people with disabilities versus people without disabilities, again, pretty stark numbers. Only about 20% of people with disabilities in the workforce versus about 68% of people without disabilities in the workforce. So there's a huge disparity there. When we unemployment of people with disabilities, we don't look at the entire population of people with disabilities unemployed, just as you don't look at the entire population of people without disabilities and look at that for the number. You're looking at those individuals currently seeking employment who are unable to obtain employment. So the unemployment rate is still drastically different. It's more than 50% different from people with disabilities versus people without disabilities, even if you factor in all of those other issues. Sometimes you'll see the statistics or you'll see the articles and see will state 70% of people with disabilities are unemployed. Well, that is if you took the entire population of people with disabilities and then looked at unemployment, you would see that 70% rate. But we don't measure unemployment in that context in the world in general. So we have to be sure that when we're making comparisons that we're doing apples and apples and not apples in oranges, even though it's still a stark difference between people with and without disabilities. just to get a framework, and I talked about this in my other sessions, but of who is and who makes up the population of people with disabilities. Only about 16% of the population of people with disabilities uses a wheelchair, crutch, cane, or any kind of mobility device, even though that's the group that we most frequently associate with disability, because it's that group we see visually. And it's also that group that we've had to make the most changes in the environment for, is having put in accessible bathrooms, having to put in automatic doors, having to put in ramps and handrails and things of that nature. So we really kind of associate disability often with the wheelchair or the crutch or the cane because of the physical environment and the barriers that we've had to remove because of that. And also because we use the symbol of the wheelchair as a symbol of disability, the international symbol. So it again gives that context of wheelchair being the disability. But in reality, the large part of people with disabilities in our community are invisible disabilities. Very high percentage of hearing impairment and visual impairment, as you can see. And these, again, are invisible. You don't know necessarily unless somebody's using a white cane or a seeing eye dog whether or not they are blind. You could have somebody who's legally blind, which would be somebody who, even with corrective lenses, has a very low vision, but yet they still may be mobile and have compensated for their mobility in the community. Somebody may be deaf and you don't see their hearing aid, or you don't see that they have a cochlear implant or something else. So again, that's an invisible to you. There are people with low hearing that do a lot of compensation for that. I recently worked with a woman in the employment setting where she worked for a CEO, and she worked in an office setting where she was the only employee, and she had an outer office and then the CEO had an inner office. And she had a pretty significant hearing loss, but she had compensated for it because she worked by herself. She didn't have any extraneous noises or things of that nature that bothered her or whatever, and she had a telephone that she could adjust the volume on and things of that nature. Well, the CEO retired and she was still with the company, and she got placed in another area within the company, and she had to share an office at that point. Well, at that point, her disability became apparent because the noise, the extraneous other people talking and things started to interfere with her job. And so she identified it to her employer and requested an accommodation, and what did they do? They let her go. And they didn't really look at, here she'd worked for them for a long time, and they let her go. Well, that didn't go well for the company, and they needed to, and were found to be in violation of the ADA. But it's just because somebody hasn't identified they have a disability and may have done their own compensatory techniques to adjust to that particular issue does not mean that person doesn't have a disability, or you put them in a different setting and their limitations may be more apparent than they are in other settings. So it's just a keep in mind, or a mindset that we have to have, is that it's a fluid issue for people, and it's not always the same for everybody in every situation that they experience. Also, major medical conditions that you don't think about or you don't see necessarily are disabilities under the ADA. Huge number of our population have mental illness. A large members of our population have learning disabilities of different degrees, health conditions, diabetes, seizure disorders, asthma, migraine headaches, people who have ulcerative colitis or other kinds of issues related to things like gluten intolerances and things of that nature. All of these groups and all these people would be considered to be part of the community of people who have disabilities. Now, whether that impacts their job or not is a whole separate issue. So that, again, there may be many people who have disabilities who have never become known to you in the workplace because their impairments that they have don't affect their ability to do the job, at least not right now. It may later, things may change for them, or they may acquire something different. So keep in mind that the majority of disability is invisible. We have an aging workforce. Each one of us is a member of it, whether we want to be or not. That we're all getting older, and by just aging itself, we acquire disabilities. We acquire different kinds of impairments. The aging population is growing. All of us that are baby boomers, we are the largest part of the population at the present time, and the prevalence is continuing to grow in that arena. So we know that in the workplace, as we have employees who stay in the workplace longer, who come back into the workplace maybe as a second career or something of that nature, they're going to potentially have a higher incidence of some type of a form of limitation. Again, may or may not impact their job at one point or another. They may not come into the workplace with that limitation, but it may exacerbate over time, or they may acquire it after they're already in the workplace. So again, keeping in mind that this is an issue, disability crosses all age groups, crosses all race, religion, etc. It's the one minority group that any one of us in this room can become a member of at any time. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mindful of. And I think as supervisors and managers, keep in mind, I always try to put myself in this situation when I'm working with somebody, and even in my own workplace where I employ a number of people with disabilities, my first line of thought is, how would I want to be treated if I was in the same circumstance or situation? If I was the person who was coming to my supervisor or manager asking for an accommodation, how would I want them to respond? How would I want them to look at me in that situation and use that as a guidepost as how I would treat others? Because I think that that is a good rule of thumb for all of us to keep in mind and think about. There was an amendment to the ADA made in 2008, largely because of the definition of disability under the ADA was challenged heavily in the courts from about 1998 through 2007. There was a great deal of discourse in the courts about who was a person with a disability. The definition of disability under the ADA comes from the Rehab Act. There are many definitions of disability out there for many different things. Each program or service may have its own or separate definition of disability, and it's important to remember that the ADA has its own definition. So while somebody may be eligible for certain benefits under a certain program because they meet the definition of disability under that program, like a parking space or something of that nature, does not necessarily automatically mean that that is a person with a disability under the ADA. It is a separate definition of disability. So when the state of Illinois issues parking placards or issues license plates to somebody, that's because that person met the definition of disability under the state of Illinois definition for disabled parking, and that means that their doctor signed the document. That does not necessarily mean that that person actually meets the definition of disability under the ADA. It's a piece of evidence, but it's not an automatic because they're two separate programs, two separate definitions, and two separate ways of which they're documented in regards to that particular issue. So just keep in mind that there is a very specific. What happened in late 1998 was there was a Supreme Court decision that came down. There was actually a trilogy of Supreme Court decisions, 3 of them, all addressing the same issue in regards to whether or not individuals using either a compensatory technique, medications, or other kind of device to address or mitigate their limitations of their disability was still a person with a disability under the ADA. So one of them was an individual who wore eyeglasses, and the question became was, if a person wears eyeglasses, are they a person with a disability? Because of course when I remove my eyeglasses, you all look great. When I put my eyeglasses back on, I might get a little different lens, right? And so am I a person with a disability when I'm not wearing my eyeglasses? Or if I have, let's say I have in the case of that was tried before the Supreme Court, there was an individual who had monocular vision, and that means that they only had vision in one eye, and so they used compensatory techniques to be turning their head, but came as to question, are they a person with a disability? Because with their compensatory techniques, they don't really exhibit any kind of limitation. And the other was an individual who used medications to control high blood pressure. And the question became whether if you could control or use something like medications to control the limitations of your disability, were you actually a person with a disability? The courts ruled that you would view somebody as a person with a disability in their mitigated state, which means that you would view whether you are still limited when you take medications to control, when you use compensatory techniques, or you use mitigating measures like eyeglasses and things of that nature. Well, that then knocked out a whole host of people who would potentially have been considered to be people with disabilities prior, because anybody who used medications, like let's say I was diabetic and I used medications to control my diabetes, or I had a seizure disorder and I used medications such, as long as I was controlled with those medications, I wouldn't be a person with a disability. But we know that as soon as I took those medications away, that person was significantly limited. So the courts kind of really veered way off of the track, and we saw from about 98 through 2007, 2008, when the ADA Amendments Act passed, a continuing narrowing. In fact, it got to the point where only about 2% of the cases that were brought forward under employment under the ADA actually went forward because people couldn't meet the definition of disability. It wasn't because the employer didn't discriminate. It was that issue, in order to pursue a case of discrimination, you always have to prove you're a member of the protected class. And if I couldn't prove that I was a member of the protected class because I was using mitigating measures, and as long as my medications and such, or my compensatory techniques, I wouldn't meet the class requirements that confess I would lose my, my protection under the law. So the courts really were narrowing it, and the ADA Amendments Act was introduced bipartisan, intended to address that issue and provide clarification to what was intended when one was looking at the issue of who is a person with a disability. So it maintained the three prong definition of disability. So under the ADA, I'm a person with a disability if I have a physical or psychological impairment that substantially limits me or more major life activities. So it's both psychological and physical. So all your senses involved, all of your neurological, all of those kinds of things are involved if I have a limitation and it substantially limits. The courts clarified that substantially limited meant that my limitation is greater than what you would expect to find in the general population. So I don't have to be so limited that I can't do something in order to have protections under the law. The issue was that I have to demonstrate that I am more limited than what you would expect to find in the general population for whatever that issue was that I was, where my impairment fell. So limited in any types of major life activities, walking, breathing, sleeping, thinking, interacting with others, et cetera, are all part of that. It also recognized that individuals who had episodic conditions were covered under the law, which means those individuals who may not always demonstrate their limitations. So there are many conditions that do not occur on an ongoing or regular basis. That they may fluctuate. So for example, somebody who has multiple sclerosis may experience fluctuations in their condition. Individuals who have asthma don't always have that limitation. Maybe weather-related and other kinds of things might be triggers for them. Individuals who might have migraines, individuals who might have fibromyalgia, all kinds of different conditions that might be episodic. Somebody who's in cancer may have been in remission versus active with their cancer. They're going to be different in different times, but they still have that limitation. It just may be not exacerbated or the limitations not showing at that time. So it clarified that particular point as well. The second prong of the definition is those who have a record of an impairment. These are individuals who had an impairment that would have qualified under the ADA, but they no longer have it. It's a past history. So somebody who was an alcoholic, somebody who was an active abuser of illegal substances, an addict, somebody who had cancer and had gone through a recovery process, somebody with a mental health issue that had gone through a recovery process, all would be considered to be covered still under the ADA for discrimination based on their past history, which means that I can't make a decision that would be discriminatory against that person based on that past history. I don't want to hire you because you have a history of alcoholism. I'm afraid that you're going to be a risk or a threat to us, that you'll start drinking again. That would be a discriminatory act to take, using that past history if that person is no longer currently actively using alcohol. Let me make the clarification. I'll do that in a second. Number three, the third prong of the definition, and this is one that we've seen increasingly find more traction in the courts, and this is the area of those that are regarded as having a disability. This is both people with disabilities and without disabilities, who if an employer takes a negative action against that individual because of an assumption made by the employer that that person is somehow limited without actually a fact or evidence that that person is limited, that person would have protections under the law under the third prong of regarded as. And this is a slippery slope for employers in this situation. We are a society that makes a lot of judgments and a lot of assumptions based on what we see or what we think about somebody, somebody's behaviors and things of that nature. If somebody is talking to themselves, we automatically make an assumption that person must have some kind of schizophrenia or some kind of mental health. Now make sure you check to see that they're not having their Bluetooth in their ear and they're having a conversation with their telephone and their telephone's in their pocket and you don't know it when you make that assumption that that person is in some way having some kind of a mental health breakdown. Because I see a lot of people out there in the community talking to themselves if that was the case. We make assumptions because somebody may have looked differently than you and I. Let's say that individual was born with a port wine stain type of birthmark that might cover a good portion of their face, etc. We make assumptions that that person might be sick or ill or have something wrong with them when actually they don't. That is, is a condition that they have, but it doesn't automatically mean that that person is ill or sick or have some kind of a condition. But we make assumptions because they look different than everybody else does. I worked with an employee who had a condition and she started to take some prednisone as part of her treatment for the condition and such. And anyone who takes prednisone, there's a certain condition that they develop that they call a moon face, where the person starts to have some retention of waters and things of that nature, and they will actually create a different look to their face and stuff. She was an aerobics instructor, and her employer made an assumption that she was ill and no longer could do her job, even though she was doing her job every day, and discharged her. She no longer fit the image and as such of that particular employer. She had no limitations that precluded her from doing her job, etc. That employer made an assumption about her abilities to do her job based on her change in appearance. That was discrimination under the ADA. That would have been in the regarded as. I could also be a person who actually does have a disability. I could be a wheelchair user, and you make an assumption that I can't do something because I'm in a wheelchair, so I couldn't do a certain task in the job. You don't promote me. You don't do something based on what you believe I can't do because I'm using a wheelchair without any real evidence that I couldn't do it. You don't know that I might use a stand-up wheelchair and be able to do that and such. You're making an assumption that I can't do it based on what you believe. That would be a regarded as claim also without actually evidence and fact. So this is an area employers really, we're starting to see a lot more case law develop, a lot more complaints being filed in this particular area. So it's definitely an area of consideration. So the major things that have changed in the statute, again, there is a list of major bodily functions that also is included in major life activities. So it's not just breathing, walking, standing, sleeping, etc. It also includes things like my hematic system, which is my blood system, my neurological system, my skeletal system, etc. So if I have a disability or a condition that affects the systems of my body, then I'm also going to be covered under the ADA. It's not just that activity of walking, sleeping, breathing, etc. Again, leads to the expansion or the much broader context of who constitutes a person with a disability than what we previously saw in that area. The Supreme Court specifically set very high standards in regards to what constitutes substantial limits. Again, going back to the fact that I only have to be able to demonstrate that my limitation is greater than what is found in the general population. I do not have to meet that. I can't do it or so severely disabled area of it. The effects of using any kind of mitigating measures or anything of that nature was clarified under the law. The only mitigating measure that has remained in the law is eyeglasses. So an individual with a disability who myself, I can use eyeglasses to correct my vision. I would not be seen as a person with a disability. But other mitigating measures, medications, compensatory techniques, things of that nature, the persons who use those, even if they're able to mitigate their limitations with those, are still seen as a person with a disability under the ADA. Now this is a different analysis of whether I'm covered under the ADA for protections and non-discrimination. This is a separate analysis from whether or not I am eligible for a reasonable accommodation. It's not an automatic, they don't go hand in hand. A person who may have a disability under the ADA is protected for discrimination in the decisions that you make to hire, to not hire, to promote, not promote, etc., based on their disability. But I still have a separate analysis as to whether or not that person requires or needs a reasonable accommodation to do their job. As I indicated earlier, there are many people who will meet that first area where they have a disability as qualified under the ADA, but they are not going to be eligible for reasonable accommodation because they have no limitations that actually impact their ability to do their job. That's a totally separate analysis. My protections for non-discrimination versus my eligibility for reasonable accommodation are two separate areas and two separate analyses that we make under the law. An impairment, again, as I already said, is the episodic or remission, and I already talked about the regarded as prong. Again, major life activities, lifting, breathing, speaking, all of those things are included as part of what is a major life activity. Major bodily functions, as I already said. And these are just some examples of where you have your different bodily functions, circulatory system, endocrine systems, things like that, different kinds of conditions that you might find that fall into here. One that we often get calls for in our office are issues of infertility because the reproductive system is one of your bodily systems. So does that mean because someone is having difficulty getting pregnant or is going to be engaged in fertility treatments and stuff that they're going to be a person automatically under the ADA? No, you would still look at to what degree, what's the limitation, et cetera, for that individual. And again, how would that relate to, again, they may be a person with a disability, but how does that relate to reasonable accommodation or their ability to do their actual job? You still have to make those connotations. Again, the ADA Amendments Act did not change the definition. It's still the 3 prongs. It only provided clarification. And it says to employers, don't spend a lot of time trying to analyze whether or not you have somebody with a disability. That if that person can demonstrate that they have limitations that are greater than what would be found in the general population, then assume that that person has a disability. Move on to the next issue, which is that person asking for a reasonable accommodation or not, and go through that analysis and that decision point. We're finding that the courts are much less tolerant of the in-depth onerous process of trying to define whether or not the person actually has a disability through a lot of documentation and such. And we'll talk about the documentation requirements here at Champaign County. Let me make a clarification about drug and alcohol. I made it earlier in some of my comments, but individuals are covered under the ADA if they are currently using and abusing alcohol. Alcoholism is a disability under the ADA. It is not illegal to use alcohol. It's illegal to purchase it under the age of 21. It's illegal to drive while you're intoxicated. It's illegal to do certain behaviors when you're intoxicated. You can get in trouble. But alcohol itself is not illegal. That's in contrast to the illegal use of controlled substances, which are protected under other laws like the Drug-Free Workplace Act and other kinds of legislation and such. So an individual who's actively, illegally engaged in the use of controlled substances would not be covered under the ADA. This includes somebody who has a prescription for controlled substances but is illegally using that controlled substance. I may have a prescription for 200 milligrams and I'm taking 500 milligrams. That is an illegal use of a controlled substance. So just because I have the doctor's note to be able to take that, I'm still illegally using that controlled substance. I would not be protected under the ADA in that particular situation. But a person who is currently somebody who has a diagnosis of alcohol addiction would be a person with a disability under the ADA. That does not mean you as employers have to accommodate that person's addiction. I don't have to give that person an altered work schedule to fluctuate for their ability to get up and come to work in the morning. I don't have to modify a workplace policy of no alcohol in the workplace or during the workday for somebody who says, you know, if I can just have a little drink, I'm going to be a better employee, you know, type of thing. I don't have to accommodate those kinds of things. So I still have, as an employee, even if I'm an alcoholic, no different if I'm an employee who has a seizure disorder or an employee who has had a stroke or has quadriplegia or some other limitation, I still have to be able to perform the job. The issue is you cannot discriminate against me because I am an alcoholic and such. I still have to perform and do the workplace duties. I'm not exempted from those rules and regulations in the workplace because of my use of alcohol. I may have to accommodate somebody for their treatment of alcohol, the same as I would accommodate somebody for their treatment of a bad hip that they just had replaced or any other kind of medical condition. So if an individual is going into a retreatment program and needed to have time off, whether or not they qualified for a Family Medical Leave Act or they were going to use ADA leave or whatever to do that, I would still need to be treating that person the same and equally. That is the treatment for the disability or the condition the same as I would any other kind of medical condition. You have to be very careful that your own religious beliefs, biases, and things of that nature do not get in the way of the decisions that you make or the actions that you take in the workplace. You may feel one thing about morality of it and all of those kinds of things. That's a whole separate issue. If you have a problem with it, work with your supervisors on it because it is not, and this is something we do see on a regular basis, is that people bring their own morals and things into the workplace, their own biases, and it has an impact on how they work with individuals in the workplace. I have known and worked with many individuals who have alcohol addiction problems who have maintained and been very good employees. They may eventually falter and fall down, but that doesn't mean that that they're a poor employee. We all, at some point, may falter and fall down for different reasons. So again, the way that you look at this is very different, and keep those things in mind and be careful of those biases because they're definitely out there and they do creep in sometimes when we're working with people. The whole premise under the ADA is I have to be a qualified individual. So even if I'm covered under the ADA as it relates to the fact that I do have a disability and I meet that first threshold of are you a person that's covered under the ADA, what we go next, especially in employment situation, is am I a qualified individual with a disability? So I still have to be qualified for the job I desire to hold or the job I currently hold. Just because I have a disability doesn't trump all of those things. So if we're hiring in a position and the person is required to have a bachelor's degree in X, Y, and Z and they come to you and say, well, because of my learning disability, I was never able to finish college. Well, you don't have the bachelor's degree. You're not qualified for the job. Your learning disability may be a factor that plays in that, but that does not play into the issue of the job. I have a right to have qualifications, a minimum of qualifications, and it's a bachelor's degree. Once you have the bachelor's degree, come and talk to me. I don't have to make those kinds of exceptions. The person has to be qualified and meet the standards and the criteria set forth by the employer, the requisite skills that are required for that job. It could be degrees, it could be years of experience, it could be anything that the employer sets forth that is part of that job. As long as the employer treats all employees in the same category of employment equally, then an employer can set that criteria. You can decide as a bachelor's degree, I can argue with you and say, you don't need a bachelor's degree to do that job. Anybody could do that job out of high school. If you say it's a bachelor's degree, it's a bachelor's degree. There's not me, I can't come in and make that argument, or I don't have a legal standing to make that argument. Under the ADA, there's very specific inquiries, medical and questions that you can and cannot ask about somebody's disability or medical condition, and it permeates through all of the phases of employment. So before I kick into this piece of it, are there any questions about the definition of disability and who is or who would be considered a person with a disability under the ADA? And let me just say that Illinois Human Rights Act, which is the other law that we operate under here in Illinois, also protects against discrimination on the basis of employment, and its definition is similar of disability parallels the ADA's definition of disability, as does Section 504 of the Rehab Act, which is the other statute that Champaign County is governed under because you are also recipients of federal funds. The definition of disability from the ADA is the same that was used in Section 504, and when they amended it in 2008, they also amended Section 504 to be similar or to be the same. So. All right. I'm going to go on to medical inquiries or employment inquiries that individuals can make and what you can and cannot ask. The rule of thumb is that you've got 3 phases of employment. You have pre-employment, you have the conditional offer of employment phase, and then you have post-employment. And there are differences in what you can ask and the information that you can seek in all different 3 of those stages. So when we think about pre-employment, pre-employment is going to be the recruitment process, the application process, and all of those things that lead up to an offer of employment. So it'll be the interview and any testing or anything that I might be doing as part of the employment process. Okay? So when I look at this issue, the rule of thumb is that I cannot ask any medical questions or questions that are likely to elicit medical information. So this is why you can't ask, and you've seen most applications, I still see some out there in the community that haven't been cleaned up yet, that can't ask things like, do you have a previous workers' comp claim? Do you have any medical conditions that would preclude you from being able to do this job? Do you have, do you take any medications or anything of those? Those are all illegal questions to ask in the application process or during the interview process under the ADA. Those have all been removed and are illegal for me to ask. The only thing that maintains or is still in there is I am still able to do testing for illegal drugs, illegal substances during the pre-employment phase. Because of the other laws, Drug-Free Workplace Act and things of that nature, I can still test for illegal use of drugs, controlled substances in that place, as long as all individuals in similarly situated scenarios would be subject to that same testing. So if I would be automatically drug testing everybody who was applying for a position or everybody applying for a certain category of positions, and I then drug tested an individual with a disability, that is fine to be able to do that. You're treating everybody the same. What would be discriminatory is maybe I don't like your look. Maybe you look like you might, have some other different kind of lifestyle or something of that nature. So you know what? I'm going to pinpoint you, and you're randomly, going to be going and doing a drug test for us in this process, but we don't any other applicants or do that. That would be a discriminatory action to be able to take. When we work with our medical providers to do medical drug testing for pre-employment, we are working with them to make sure that they do not provide us information that we should not have in regards to that. We only want information as it would relate to the use of illegal substances. We don't want any information that might relate to that person's use of a phenobarbital for a seizure disorder or anything else of that nature. We do not want them to have that. It's kind of like sitting on the witness stand and being drilled by attorneys who then, you have an objection from the other side and it's already been heard by the jury and you strike it from the record, and how do you actually guarantee or assure that that has been struck from the record. So you don't even want that information in the first place in regards to those kinds of things about any prescription medications, stuff that the person might legally be using that is out of that mix. But you do have to treat and make sure that people are the same. There's confidentiality of medical information. All individuals, not just people with disabilities, medical information, all medical information needs to be maintained in a confidential manner, which means it needs to be only available to those who are on a need-to-know basis for the determination of things like reasonable accommodations and such. It's not something that we put in regular personnel files or anything of that nature. Once I have a candidate that I'm considering for employment or for hire, I am able to do conditional offer of employment and make those conditional offers of employment based on certain issues that might relate to that person's ability to do the job because or due to a disability. So for example, in a conditional offer of employment, I can subject someone to a medical exam. In fact, there are no limits to what I can actually ask somebody in a medical exam in a conditional offer of employment, as long as everyone in similar situated positions for application would be subject to the same set of medical exams. So again, I can't decide that, oh, you know what, maybe I should have you do an HIV test, even though the last one who I just had go through here, I didn't have them do an HIV test, but there's something about you, I think we might want to have that HIV test. That would be discriminatory. If I did everybody an HIV test, that's fine. If I did everybody a full body scan, that's fine. I can't single out. Now, I may need to follow up if there's information that comes from a medical exam that might require a follow-up. Let's say I did a back exam and there was something that was found in the back exam I need to do a follow-up testing with, even though I didn't do that with all other applicants. That was a cause and effect. There was something found in that medical exam that needed additional inquiry and additional examination. That would be okay to do. But I have to make sure, again, that I am treating everyone equally and the same. If there is something that occurs during that medical examination process that would make it us believe that that person was not qualified to do the job, or that there would be an issue for that person to be able to do the job, I am able to withdraw the offer of employment at that point. But my withdrawal of the offer of employment has to be predicated on the fact that there is a direct threat, that particular issue makes that person unqualified and there's no accommodation present that would allow that person to still be able to do their job. So let's say, for example, that you had somebody who you did testing and that person tested positive for hepatitis, and they were going to have a position that was part of the public, et cetera, and you had to say, hey, I'm not going to hire this person. They've got hepatitis, and that's contagious and an issue that could be problematic for our contact with our community. You'd have to look at whether there would be an accommodation available, possibly allowing that person to go on treatment. They did not know they had active hepatitis, go for treatment, maybe delaying the start date for that person, depending on whether that was reasonable as an accommodation issue in your setting, et cetera, to allow that person to be able to address that hepatitis issue so that they would no longer be active and would be then qualified. So there's caveats to those issues as well. Again, case by case, situation by situation, you would be able to look at those things. It is, again, permissible to ask medical questions during this period of time and get information during this period of time as long as I'm treating everybody else the same. And again, only can I withdraw the offer of employment if I can demonstrate direct threat or that the person's unqualified and there's not an accommodation that could be used or utilized to allow that person. So even like, say, a back exam. We do back exams, we find that person might have had some surgery or that person might have a slipped disc or something of that nature shows up in the back exam. That's not an automatic disqualifier for somebody who might do a physical labor or other kind of job. I'd have to do case by case, look at, is there an accommodation? Maybe this is going to be an issue for this person to have limited lifting or something of that nature. Is there an accommodation that could be put in place that would still allow this person to be qualified to be able to do the job with a reasonable accommodation? So it's not an automatic. I still have to look at that issue of reasonable accommodation even at this point in the process. Then in post-employment, now I'm already employed, you've hired me, I'm working for you. The limitations of asking medical questions at this point are really limited to what would be a right to, or a need to know based on business necessity. So for example, if I have a policy in place, let's say in your highway department, you have a policy in place that if anyone has an accident with one of the trucks or whatever, or any kind of accident out in the field, there's automatically testing for drug and alcohol. That would be perfectly permissible. That's a cause and effect accident occurred, that you're going to do testing of those kinds of things. So that's a medical test, but it's got a cause and effect situation. If you have policies in place for return to work after somebody's been out on a medical leave or nature, again, cause and effect, those are legitimate policies to have in place related to those kinds of things. What it precludes you from being able to do is just that you see somebody limping and requiring that they go in for a medical exam. Or something. There's got to be a correlation, there's got to be a cause and effect, something that either that person presents a direct threat of some type with their limping or what they're seeing. It can't just be because I observed something. I have to have something that actually is a defensible reason as to why I would cause somebody to do that. I can do random drug testing as long as it is random. That is perfectly permissible. Everyone is subject to that. It's a random testing process. Those are perfectly legitimate policies. I may have medical exams required for certain kinds of positions in place. If I have employees who are required to have a CDL license as part of their job, and there's medical testing requirements that go as part of that position, or other kinds of licensure or certifications and things of that nature that people do, that there's a medical inquiry that is required as part of that process. Those are legitimate. That's consistent with business necessity for that person to be able to hold that certification or be qualified to do that particular job or particular task. But you just have to be careful in that post-employment as to what you're doing with medical inquiry. It's also permissible to have voluntary programs. You can have voluntary blood screening programs, voluntary blood pressure or other kinds of fitness programs and things of that nature. The key is that they have to be voluntary. They can't be required. There's some new regulations that right out now are out for public comment till the end of about mid-February, I think, that the federal government is looking at in putting out guidance and regulations as it relates to employers who have plans where they may link certain requirements to participate in health and fitness activities and things of that nature as part of their benefits packages and things of that nature, or to have reductions in their insurance and stuff of that nature. There's new regulations coming out as to what extent someone can hold somebody with a disability to those kinds of things and the caveats related to that. Because of my disability, I may not be able to achieve the same things as somebody else without a disability, and there's caveats about how that is looked at. So if you're interested, if that's an area, there are rules that are out for right now, proposed rulemaking, again, for public comment into February related to that particular issue. So we'll see some additional guidelines coming out from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on that particular issue in the near future. So are there any questions related to specifically the whole issue of what I can and cannot ask, or the medical inquiry in the various phases of employment? Yes, go ahead. Yes. Excellent question. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, so the question is, let's say you don't ask any questions, but during the interview process, the person volunteers. And there's different things that people could volunteer. They could volunteer their past medical history to explain maybe why they have a gap in their work, history or something of that nature. They may come right out front and just disclose their disability because they are one of those people that wants everybody to know everything about them on the table. Or they may disclose the need for a reasonable accommodation during the interview that then obviously gives you medical information as well when they say, well, due to whatever, I need a reasonable accommodation. When the ADA was passed in 1990 and the regulations were promulgated in 1991, the rule of thumb under the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was at that time, don't ask, don't tell. People with disabilities don't say anything, employers don't ask any questions, etc. That was modified in 1994 when the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission put out some new guidance on issues of medical inquiries, and they laid out 3 scenarios for employers as it relates to these particular issues. One is when an employee comes into an interview with an obvious disability. What can I do, or what are the parameters for an employer in regards to that particular issue? You got an elephant in the room. If the person comes in to an interview and they're using a white cane, which indicates that they are blind, to not have a conversation during the interview about certain job-related issues, not about the disability, but job-related issues, which you may not have asked previous applicants, would hold you as an employer with no information as to whether this person was qualified if you didn't ask the questions. So for example, you may not have asked somebody previously of how they would deal with a computer screen. But it's very relevant to somebody who's blind to know how they're going to deal with information on a computer screen. So it would be okay for me to ask that question because it's directly related to the job and the job duties. It would be inappropriate for me to ask questions about how blind are you. It would be inappropriate to ask me about whether or not it's permanent or how did you lose your sight, or anything of that nature, but it would be appropriate for me to ask, this job requires that you be able to use a computer screen, or you deal with written correspondence, or you deal with X, Y, and Z. How would you do that? And it would be up to the employee to explain or discuss with you how you would do that. It opens the conversation on that issue where you may not have asked previous applicants that same question. That's one. Two is when the individual in the interview situation discloses a disability to the employer during the interview process. In that case, what the employer, this is a slippery slope, you have to be very careful, is that the only questions that you can ask in relationship to that is whether or not there is anything related to that disability that they believe would create any kind of difficulty or problem for them being able to do their job. Okay? So you're leaving it up to them. You do not want to go fishing. Okay? You want to be very careful. So for example, let's say you had a previous employee with diabetes and you knew what that employee experienced and some of the issues that you experienced with that particular employee. Now this employee discloses to you that they also have diabetes. And so what's happening in your mind is you're going through the previous employee and all the things that happened, and maybe that person eventually lost their sight, maybe that person had all kinds of brittle diabetic, had episodes in the workplace with their sugar drops and things of that nature, passed out or whatever else it might happen. And that's going through your head and stuff of that nature. Don't go down that road. You got to be very careful. Everybody with a disability experiences their disability differently and manages their disability differently. You could take 5 people with the same diagnosis and they're all going to present different in regards to that diagnosis. So you have to be very careful not to make assumptions that that person's going to have the same experiences as somebody previously did. So what you only really can do in that case is ask the individual, as they have disclosed a disability, is there anything related to your disability that would preclude you from doing any of the functions of this job as it has been explained to you? Now, if that person brings up the fact that, and that's the third area, that brings up the fact that they need an accommodation during the interview. You haven't asked about it, but let's say you're having the course of discussion of hours of work or something of that nature, and the person brings up the fact, well, due to my narcolepsy, I have difficulties being able to be in work on time in the morning, and I would need some flexibility in relationship to my start time. I'm basically asking you for a reasonable accommodation at that time. You cannot explore the disability. You can't ask questions about the narcolepsy. You can't ask questions about your controlled, not controlled medications, whatever, et cetera. How do you manage your narcolepsy? All you can deal with is that situation that that person's identifying at that time as related to flexibility in their schedule. So you can explore that issue as it would relate to doing the job. So you would be appropriate to ask questions. What are you talking about? 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half hour, hour? Is this frequency? Daily, whatever kind of thing. You can explore the request or the comment as it would relate to doing the job itself. But you cannot explore or go into the discussion of the disability in that context. So there are those 3 areas that you can make inquiry. The focus is, and what you always should be thinking about in that context is, keep it focused on the job. Don't focus it on the disability itself. Focus it on what is the job tasks and how that person, even with that limitation, would do the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. Keep that as your focus and not the other things, and you'll be okay. And of course, document, document, and document more. What was said, what response, what happened. And be very careful about any response that you make. So what happens there in those situations is you've now got potentially a red herring. You have a situation that has made it known to you that they have a disability, they're in the applicant pool, et cetera. Now, what you potentially face is if you do not choose that applicant as part to move forward in the next process, is how can I defend if it was questioned, because now that person knows that I know information about their disability. So we are a very litigious society, and there will be people who will pursue a complaint of discrimination if they believe you didn't hire them because they told you something. So you do have to be careful as to what you do and what your decision making is, and make sure that you can defend. You made your decision based on the fact that this person only had 2 years of experience and you were looking for 2 or more, and you have a candidate who has 3 years of experience. They're more qualified for the job. It's harder to do in entry-level positions when everybody is often very much the same. They don't have a lot of experience. They don't have a lot of things to set them apart from each other. You just need to make sure that you can defend that you did not use the information that that person gave you to screen them out without going through the process to determine whether they truly were or were not qualified for that job based on the disability-related factor that came as part of the discussion. It does create difficult situations. Not impossible, just common sense. Use common sense. Look at it objectively. Don't think of it as, well, boy, if I hired this other person, I wouldn't have to even work. about these reasonable accommodation issues. Let me warn you right now. Just because I didn't tell you about it in the interview doesn't mean I don't need an accommodation. I don't have a requirement to tell you in the interview that I needed an accommodation. So you could hire somebody, remember, majority of disability is invisible. The wheelchair, the white cane, those stick out. Person who needs a sign language interpreter in the interview, those stick out. You're going to have a conversation. There's that white elephant in the room. How are you going to communicate? How are you going to do this? How are you going to do that? You don't know about the invisible disability. So I could be hired, and the second week on the job, come forward with a limitation that you knew nothing about until now, because it wasn't part of the interview, the testing, or any of those other kinds of things. So just think about the fact that just because it may require some reasonable accommodation to hire somebody who has a disability does not mean that they're going to be more work or less work than any other employee that you have, and don't make your decisions or your determinations based on that. That is going to get you in trouble or make it more difficult for you to defend why a decision will be made or not made in those circumstances. Other questions on that line? Okay. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
You didn't mention it, but is obesity considered a...
Disability? No. Obesity is not a disability under the ADA. USC has made that pretty clear. The issue, though, is there's typically an underlying condition that may be causing the obesity that would be a disability under the ADA.
Or you would get a disability
Because of your obesity, right, it could cause.
like a physical agility test or something, and
It's perfectly allowable to have a physical agility test as long as that test is consistent with business necessity. So I'm not going to put a secretary through a, climb up and down, crawl under and do, whatever. That would be not consistent with business necessity. But in some of our positions, let's say in our highways, in our law enforcement, in other areas, you may have very legitimate business necessity issues related to agility. And it would be perfectly permissible for you to have an agility test that somebody had to pass in order to move forward. Not passing. Just as it would be perfectly permissible in certain positions for you to have a math test or a reading test or other kinds of tests. Testing is perfectly permissible under the ADA as long as what is being tested is, again, consistent with business necessity. So there's not a prohibition. You would do those, you can do that testing, the agility testing and things of that nature in the interview pre-employment phase. Perfectly permissible to do that. Now, you may have somebody who requests a reasonable accommodation. If the request for reasonable accommodation is to be exempted from the agility test because they know they wouldn't be able to do it, or aspects of the agility test, again, you would look at that, would that be a fundamental alteration if what we're looking at and the agility test is the basis of is whether you're fit to be able to do this particular job. What often gets challenged in the agility testing issue is at what point are you holding all employees in that category or that position to that level of fitness? So that's been a criticism that has happened in regards to, we do it at new employment, new hire situations, but we never then hold current employees to those same standards doing the same job. Because I may have been hired at 24 and at 35, my body and everything else looks very different and I can't run the same things or do the same things, but yet I'm doing the same job. So this becomes an issue and it has been challenged at different points because of those things. But it's not that it's illegal or it's not permissible to do that. Yeah, testing is definitely something that, again, the notion behind any testing, again, is making sure that it's not medical in nature. So I can't have you do the agility test. Oh, by the way, check your pulse before you start that climb, and then afterwards and tell me what it is. Now I'm taking a medical measurement. That would be a medical test. That would be illegal under the law to be able to do that. I could do that during the conditional offer of employment phase where it's permissible for me to gather medical information, but not during the pre-employment phase where I'm screening candidates out in that process. Remember, under conditional offer of employment, I'm saying you are my candidate, I want to hire you, but it's conditional upon certain things like a medical test or a determination of reasonable accommodation or whatever. And I only can withdraw that offer when I have a legitimate reason to do so. So that's why I have to look at where and what phase I'm doing things. Yes? Sure.
Hire someone and they don't disclose their
Disability. Okay, Okay, so the question is, what if you hire somebody who has not disclosed their disability, and then after they're hired, they disclose a disability that demonstrates that they're not able to do the job for what they do? They're no different than any other employee who may experience anything at any point. It doesn't matter whether my disability is identified my first day of employment, my 5th day of employment, or my 25th year of employment. I'm treated the same along that whole line. And that with anybody, I have to be qualified to do the job, which means I have to be able to continue to be able to do the job for which I have been hired into, currently hold, with or without a reasonable accommodation. So if somebody identifies they have a disability, whether again it's the first day of employment, 5th day of employment, 25th year of employment, you're going to go through the same process, which is we identify what is the limitation of the job, and how does that relate to your disability or the impairment from your disability, and what are the potential reasonable accommodations that would be available for you to be able to do that. If our end answer is, after we go through the reasonable accommodation process, that there is no reasonable accommodation available, that means I am no longer qualified for that job, which means that I would be separated the same as you would separate anybody who's not qualified to do their job. Okay, so what you first have to look at, though, under the ADA is the ADA says my first obligation as an employer when I have an employee who cannot do their current job with a reasonable accommodation is to look at reassignment to a different position. So under the ADA, there was a ruling in the 7th Circuit that was here in Illinois, actually from the Illinois Department of Transportation, that ruled on reassignment that an employer did not have an obligation to hire the person in a position if they were not the most qualified person in that position. However, there's been a more recent 7th Circuit case that has reversed that previous decision. And what it says is that it's an employer's obligation to look at reassignment and not require the person to compete for a vacant position. If there is a vacant position that that person would be qualified for, they don't have to be the most qualified. They have to be qualified for, that they would be able to do with or without reasonable accommodation, then I would move them or reassign them into that other position as a reasonable accommodation. Okay, so that would be my first, if there's not, or if the position that I was going to be reassigning the person to, lower pay or something of that nature, and the employee did not want to take it, then again, we would go through the same process of termination that we would with any employee who was not qualified or did not want to take the position that was offered. Okay, so that's where reassignment comes in to that. But that doesn't matter if it's my first day, my 5th day, or my 25th year. Okay, I'm an employee. Once I'm an employee, I'm treated the same whether I'm a new employee or not. Years of service do not play into that scenario. That's different than when you start to look at things like other laws, like FMLA. I'm not eligible for FMLA until I've worked, within a 12-month period of time. I would think, what is it, 18 hours or something of that nature. But anyway, I have to work a certain period of time to be eligible for FMLA. ADA is not like that. I'm eligible for leave under the ADA the first day of my employment. It may not be paid leave because I don't have any accrued leave, but I'd be eligible for leave as a reasonable accommodation. And that's different and separate from FMLA. Okay. Again, medical records are need to know. I'm going to talk a little bit about reasonable accommodation. That should be a hyperlink there, Tammy. So there is the handbook that's available for Serving People with Disabilities Handbook for Champaign County. This is available on your intranet. If you scroll down, Tammy, you can see the table of contents. And there is information here about hiring and interviewing. There's information about requests for reasonable accommodation and also under employment. So there is information available in that handbook. This is to you. This is a guide for you as employees here within the county to assist you. We ask, or the county asks, that you use the form of this document that's on the website. So try to refrain from printing it or saving it locally. If you do, always refer back to the one that's online because they may have made changes to it since you last printed it or saved it, and you are responsible for working with the most current version of it in regards to what the current policies, practices, and procedures are here in Champaign County. But this is an additional resource for you that kind of backs up some of my conversations today for you to be able to turn to. And again, this is on your intranet site. Here. So reasonable accommodations, we've already started to talk about a little bit, is modifying the job, the work environment, or the way that things are usually done in what we do. So there's some principles of reasonable accommodation to keep in mind. One is that an accommodation must be effective. It's not just giving me the accommodation, but whatever that accommodation is, it needs to be effective. It doesn't have to be the most or best accommodation. It just has to be an effective accommodation. It doesn't have to be my preferred accommodation. I may prefer that you provide me with the Lexus, and instead I'm going to give you the Ford Focus. Okay? That I don't have a right to the Lexus. I have a right to an effective accommodation. So if the Ford Focus will be effective for me, then that's all you're required to provide me. So someone may start with a request for an accommodation that is their preferred accommodation. That does not mean that that's what they're going to get. That is a starting point for the discussion. That's identifying and starting with what's the limitation, what kind of accommodation do you believe you need, and that's where we start. So let's say, for an example, I have an employee who asks for altered work hours. And that person wants altered work hours maybe to do physical treatment for a hip or something of that nature, a disability that they might have, and they need to go to physical therapy a couple days a week, and they're asking to be able to either come in late in the morning or leave early in the afternoon to be able to do that. That's what's on the table. That's the request for the accommodation. What you need to do as an employer is look at what is the need for that person, what's the limitation that that person particularly has, and what would be a potential reasonable accommodation. Is it going to be reasonable for us to let that person leave early? Can we let them use some of their accrued sick time and such to be able to do that? What's the impact on the operations to be able to do that? Maybe morning's not going to work because we need them because that's the highest time of volume of work. But maybe leaving a half hour early in the afternoon might be a reasonable accommodation. So that starts the point of dialogue for you, but it may not be what the final outcome is. You have to look at those things. Or the answer in the end might be, no, I can't do that. Maybe you need to look at whether or not you have options that are after hours or something else. Remember, I have the right to use my accrued time as a person with a disability, the same as people without disabilities have a right to use their accrued time. So the only time I really have to ask you for a reasonable accommodation for things like appointments or leave is when I'm asking you to make a modification and provide me leave that would be beyond what any other employee would already have available to them through their use of accrued time and things of that nature. So you may have employees who are doing things using their accrued time, and it only would be asking for an accommodation when now they've exhausted their accrued time and may need to use additional time. But up to that point, they haven't asked for a reasonable accommodation because they have a right to use their accrued time the way that anybody would do for doctor's appointments or things of that nature. So it's not just because I have a disability that I treat it or deal with it differently. It's only when I'm asking for an exception or asking to be considered in a different manner than what anybody else would be considered in those kinds of situations or scenarios. Reasonable accommodation only applies to accommodations that reduce barriers to employment as they relate to my disability. So it's a barrier to the employment arena. So I'm not responsible to get you to work in the morning unless I get everybody to work or get everybody in similarly classed positions to work. It's not my responsibility because you can't, because of your disability, drive to work or get a ride to work. It's not my responsibility to provide you that. That's your responsibility. If travel is part of my job, if travel is part of something I have to do as part of my job, there may need to be accommodations in relationship to actually doing the travel as part of the job. So I may need to provide somebody a driver as an accommodation or provide somebody some alternative methods of transportation and such as an accommodation, but getting them back and forth to work, that's not my responsibility as an employer. So again, those are types of accommodations. I'm not saying that that would be reasonable in every situation, but just using that as an example. I'm not required to provide accommodations that are primarily for personal use. I'm not required to provide the wheelchair. I'm not required to provide the seeing eye dog. I'm not required to provide the hearing aids, things of that nature that are primarily of personal use for somebody. But there are times when something may be what we think of as personal use, but actually is work-related. Let's say you have somebody who's got a mobility-related issue. Maybe they don't use a wheelchair or anything of that nature, but they have difficulty moving around. And it's obvious, you watch them, maybe they have arthritis or other kinds of issues, and it takes them a long time to get from point A to point B. And let's say that their job responsibilities are that, this building's kind of confusing. You have to go to different parts and different areas of this building. I don't know all the things that happen or over in other buildings that you have, et cetera. And that person's demonstrating difficulty being able to get to point A to B in a timely manner to be able to do their job. You didn't hire them for their speed. You hired them for their knowledge and their qualifications and things of that nature. So it may be a reasonable accommodation to provide that person a scooter in the workplace to be able to get from point A to B. That doesn't mean I get to use that scooter to go to the Champaign County Fair, unless that's part of my job responsibilities. I don't get to use it to go to lunch It's an employment-related accommodation. It's not a personal device for me to use for my personal reasons or my personal use, shopping, et cetera. It belongs to the county. It works. It's here. It stays here in the county offices or whatever, and I'm using it only in the workplace. That would be an example of something that might be something you provide. Let's say you had an employee who uses a wheelchair, and part of their job is they're out into different environments or different terrains within the county as part of their job, and they're very good at being able to do that. The difference is, however, that their wheelchair, the everyday tires that they use on their wheelchair may be problematic to be able to get through certain kinds of gravel or grass or things of that nature. I may actually, as an accommodation, provide that person an off-road type tire to be able to use in the workplace. That doesn't mean that that person takes it to go camping, and do anything of that nature. It's a workplace accommodation. They use that tire when they're out in the field for the workplace. They don't use that tire for personal uses. That is something I'm accommodating for that person as it relates to that issue. So those are just examples of where there might be some deviation. We don't see those a lot, but we do come across those, and I would have to look at those kinds of things. ADA does not prevent me as an employer from doing more. I can always go above and beyond. ADA is the minimum. As an employer, I can provide additional accommodations. If I, as an employer, want to provide a personal care assistant for somebody, that's my choice to do that. I'm not required to do that. I can always do more. The ADA is the legal bottom. So you can always decide as an employer to do more. And in most cases, we find that employers do a lot more and have been doing accommodations in the workplace way before the ADA came along. We've been making workplace accommodations for our employees for a variety of different reasons for a long time. The ADA just puts more of a legal context onto it and a framework for being able to work within it. Individuals with disabilities are responsible for identifying the need for the accommodation. It is not your responsibility to second guess that someone needs an accommodation. They can use plain English. I have an impairment. I need some assistance or help in doing that. I don't have to use the formal language of reasonable accommodation. However, it is appropriate that an employer may require somebody to follow the policies and procedures internal to that organization to request a reasonable accommodation in a more formal way. So I may have a conversation with my supervisor or manager, one of you, about my need for accommodation, but immediately you would have the responsibility to make sure that the employee goes through the appropriate channels here in Champaign County for the formal request of that accommodation. So we don't want to preclude you having that conversation, that dialogue with that employee, but you definitely want to make sure that it gets documented. The reasons that's a protection for both of you. We have to be very careful of he said, she said types of conversations. Had the conversation, everything was fine until it went wrong. And then now we got to say, well, you never told me that. Well, yes, I did tell you that. Well, you never told me that. Well, how do I prove I ever told you that? So you've got to look at this issues from, it's a protection on both sides, documenting what the disability, what the need is for the accommodation, the process, the decision-making process as a protection for both sides in that regard. Someone may use another party to request an accommodation on their behalf. An individual may have the type of a disability that precludes them. Maybe they have difficulty with those kinds of conversations and things. They may use a family member, an advocate, or someone else to request the accommodation on their behalf. That would be perfectly permissible as long as there was permission given by that person to have that person act on their behalf. There is a form on the website that is been developed by the county for requesting reasonable accommodations. Again, it's in the same place. And if you want to just open that form, yep, that's the medical one. Yeah. So if you can see, this is a employee request for reasonable accommodation form. The employee would fill this out with their name. They would identify the time-sensitive nature of it, if it's something that's going to happen or have an impact tomorrow versus if it's not. Obviously, we would respond in a different time frame if it was time-sensitive. Limitation, identifying what is it that limitates you from being able to do things in your job. What functions are you having difficulty doing? Or also it could be that there's an issue of a benefit or privilege that they might be requesting. So for example, parking, I'll use as an example. Parking is a privilege, it's not a right. An employer does not have a legal obligation unless there's some local ordinance or something that states an employer must provide parking. Like downtown Chicago, if you build a building, you have to provide so many parking spaces. That's an ordinance in the city of Chicago. There might be those kinds of things. But the issue is that you're looking at that issue. So somebody who needs, even though if I pull up in this back parking lot back here, you've got X number of designated accessible parking spaces. This building's open to the public as well as to your employees. So you've got to make a distinction in regards to what's available for public and what's available to the employees, and meeting our obligations on both sides of things. So if all my employees who happen to have a placard from the state of Illinois come and use up all of the accessible parking spaces in the back, and they're here 8 hours, now I have no public parking for employees. And not everybody who needs accessible parking needs an 8-foot space with an 8-foot access aisle. And maybe I only need proximity to the door or something of that nature. I don't need the actual accessible space. So asking or using parking just because I'm an employee does not mean I just get to pull into that parking space that's out there that has the hang tag. That's for when I go to the shopping mall. That's when I go to the restaurant. In employment, it's a different relationship that I have with the employer as it relates to parking. And I would be dealing with that as a reasonable accommodation issue because the county has its obligations and responsibilities to the public as well as to its employees. It needs to manage those particular issues. But that's just an example of a privilege of employment versus a job duty specific issue from the employment perspective. So I would need to complete this form, and I would be then submitting this form to my ADA coordinator. Each of your agencies has a ADA coordinator that is responsible. Everyone knows who your ADA coordinator is, I hope. Everybody does? Okay. And of course then Tammy, wherever she is over there, is the overall county ADA coordinator and or supervisor, and then this gets processed through the appropriate channels here at in Champaign. As a supervisor manager, obviously you're part of the discussion and the decision making as it relates to reasonable accommodation. What is going to be reasonable, what's going to be operational for your organization and such. My caveat to you is that never say no as your first response. We can't do that is the worst thing that you can ever say. You have to explore the options. You have to explore what the options are and document those options before you get to know. That will go a long way into making sure that you've gone through the right process, that you're protecting the county, but that you're also going and ensuring that the employee is getting a fair evaluation of what might be the accommodation request and the outcome of that accommodation request. Documentation of disability is part of requesting an accommodation. When there is an obvious disability, an employer should, does not need to have extensive documentation. So for example, if a person comes in using a wheelchair and asks for an accessible parking space, to have me do extensive documentation of that need for that accessible parking space would be unwarranted. If somebody comes in who is deaf and already identifies as deaf, it would be unwarranted for me to request a whole bunch of hearing tests from that person to document the fact that they actually have a hearing loss and need those accommodations. Those are obvious disabilities. Not all disabilities are obvious, not all disabilities are related. And again, let's say that person who has a hearing loss comes in and asks for an ergonomic chair. There's not a correlation between my hearing loss and an ergonomic chair. So it's perfectly permissible for me, even though I have a disability that's obvious, to ask for medical documentation because there's not a correlation between the two things as far as what we're looking at or we're talking about. So looking at that issue, so there is a document that is also available on that same website, which is the medical documentation form. This documentation form would need to be completed by the employee and their appropriate medical personnel. When I talk about appropriate medical personnel, it means somebody who's qualified to speak to the particular issue. So my last trying to use the example of not having your podiatrist document your mental health issue. Okay, that would not be appropriate medical personnel. So I would need to have somebody who would be skilled and also who has been treating me, not my fly-by-night, went one time to urgent care, and you know that person saw me for 10 minutes and can document my disability. That also is not going to be sufficient or adequate documentation as well. So this form needs to be completed, it spells those things out. It would then be submitted as part of the reasonable accommodation process. Someone might complete the form for requesting reasonable accommodation and then follow up with the medical form. They might submit them together. That's a process. The issue of reasonable accommodation is an interactive process between the employer and the employee. And that means that both parties have to cooperate and participate. So if I fail to submit my documentation or fail to complete the process of giving you information or answering your questions and participating in the potential exploration of different options for reasonable accommodation, then I am not cooperative in that process. I need to be able to be cooperative. Same though as on your side, you need to be cooperative, which means you need to be able to listen, you need to be able to willing to explore different options with employees about potential reasonable accommodation as well. So it's a two-way street, it's a double scenario for people. So you can go ahead. I cannot ask for documentation, I said already, when it is already available, like I already have documentation of disability. I don't need to redocument. I don't have to follow up every year. Unless there is an issue that we determine that it's a short-term nature that the accommodation necessary. Let's say somebody has cancer or something of that nature, needs a short-term accommodation while they're going through treatment and things of that nature. If there's another request for accommodation down the road that would be different, I could ask for different additional documentation nature of it. So you look at what the nature of the accommodation is or the nature of the disability in regards to that. But to have somebody every year have to turn in a letter to support the fact that they have to have accessible parking when they're using a wheelchair, that would be unnecessary documentation. So it is, as I said, it's a interactive process. When the accommodation process needs to be initiated by an employer, when the employer knows that there's a disability that is interfering with job performance. If there's an obvious disability and I'm seeing an employee have or struggle with job-related performance issues, I cannot just put my head in the sand, and just ignore it. I need to open the window for that person to identify or request a reasonable accommodation. I'm not going to go up to them and say, hey, Joe, I noticed that, that you're having trouble in your wheelchair today or anything of that nature. It should be, though, related to whether the job tasks are and opening the window, such as, hey, Joe, I noticed that in the last couple of weeks you've had a harder time in being able to complete your job responsibilities. Is there anything that we can do to assist you to be able to complete those responsibilities? To ignore that until the person fails would be another area that you could find yourself in some liability for. So again, opening. If I refuse to walk through it and say, oh, there's nothing wrong, no problem, whatever, my performance continues to fail, I would be treated like any other employee whose performance is failing in that particular situation. When I look at reasonable accommodation, again, the request needs to be reasonable, so it's in context to what is going on in your organization related to that. What is the impact of the accommodation? Is it effective? What will be the impact on the other operations of the organization? And that it not pose a undue hardship on the employer's operations. Again, it could be a financial hardship, but let me just warn you that the courts have not found governmental entities to be eligible for much at all in the financial hardship area. It's not just looking at the budget of my department, not just looking at juvenile justice or not looking at sheriff's department or whatever else it may be. It'd be the overall budget of the entire county that would be looked at in the context of whether just something was determined to be a financial hardship or not. So financial hardship is very difficult to argue. Other kinds of hardships like administrative hardships. If I have a small office operating with 2 employees and 1 employee is telling me that they can't come to work on a regular basis, that could negatively impact our ability to serve our customers. That could be an operational hardship that could occur in that particular situation. So you would look at that differently than a financial hardship would be. Reasonable accommodation does not include, I'm never required to eliminate essential functions, which means I'm never required to take away the things that are critical to do that job as a reasonable accommodation. So if I have somebody in the highway department that their responsibility is to be out on the roads, checking things, and that person says I no longer can drive, and do those kinds of things, or I can't work in the cold, or whatever else that may be, I'm never required to remove those essential functions from that job as a reasonable accommodation. I'm never required to lower production standards. I'm never required to say you have to do less than what everybody else is doing or what is expected in the job. So somebody says that I only can handle 10 cases a day instead of the normal expectation of 25 cases a day. That would not be a reasonable accommodation that I would be required to lower the production standards. I might need to look at what can I do to assist that person to reach 25. So maybe helping them automate with some different technologies or things that would make that be faster for them to be able to do their job, et cetera. That would be an accommodation, but not lowering the production standard. Again, not required to provide a personal use item. I'm also not required to do light duty. Light duty is an issue under workers' comp, where somebody who's eligible under workers' comp might have a light duty assignment as it relates to your obligations under worker comp law and under your insurance company for that. That is not a concept that's used under the ADA. Light duty, I need to be able to do the job for which I hold. It's not an accommodation to do light duty as an ADA accommodation. Again, there's all different kinds of accommodations, modifying policies and practices, letting somebody have liquids at their desk where you otherwise would say, no, you can't have liquids, something like that. The use of fragrances, wearing or use of fragrances, things of that nature, asking other employees to refrain from using fragrances. This is a really delicate one because this is where you're starting to potentially infringe on other people's rights and things of that nature. I can only control what I can control as an employer. I can request that employees refrain from using fragrances when I have an employee who has sensitivities and things of that nature, but I can't require employees to do those kinds of things. I can require and do what I can control, so I can change the cleaning substances that we use in the bathrooms. I can change the soaps and things that we use here internally or things of that nature, but I can't control the public. It would not be reasonable, especially if you're in a public service kind of a position, to put a sign on the door that says, everyone, no fragrances coming in here. It's very difficult to control the public and things of that nature. So there's going to be a extent to what I can do, but I do have to do what I can do. Again, allowing a service animal in the workplace. Let me just briefly say the issue of service animals. Under Title II of the ADA, which is the other actions of serving the public, service animals are limited to dogs, and you're not required to allow emotional support animals. And we had a whole conversation in the counterstaff training about this issue. Employment is different under Title I. There are no specifications under Title I as to what would be done. If a person asks to have an emotional support animal as a reasonable accommodation in the workplace, you would need to consider that as an accommodation in the workplace. Not saying you're going to say yes, I'm just saying that it's on the table for consideration. That's different than letting a customer come in with a citizen come in with an emotional support animal, because they're not covered by the ADA. But in employment, it's a reasonable accommodation. You may need to consider that kind of a thing. So service animals and emotional support animals are different under Title I of the ADA than they are under Title II of the ADA. It's, again, a reasonable accommodation under Title I. So if somebody wants to bring in their emotional support dog because it makes them feel better, that would be on the table as a reasonable accommodation for consideration. I'm not saying you have to do it. I'm saying it's on the table as a consideration as to whether it's reasonable for you to be able to do that in an employment context. Modifying facilities, installing electric doors, ramps, modifying bathrooms, some of the physical changes you might make to someone's workplace would be a reasonable accommodation issue for them, specific to their workplace. You already have these obligations in the public areas, but now we're starting to talk employment areas, which might be things like direct lighting instead of fluorescent lighting for somebody, might be things about looking at strobe alarms and things of that nature in somebody's workspace because they have a seizure disorder or something of that nature. All those kinds of things could come into play as part of modifying the environment. Providing somebody pieces of equipment, things like ergonomic workstations, assistive technologies like certain software packages and things of that nature might be reasonable accommodations. I might just take something already in-house and modify it. I don't necessarily have to go out and buy a fancy desk. I could just put some blocks under a desk and raise it for somebody. So I may be just modifying something that already exists versus purchasing something that is new or might be more expensive or maybe higher tech in relationship to that. I may need to require a service or acquire a service for someone, sign language interpreters, real-time captioners, things of that nature. I'm never required to hire two people to do the same job. So if I'm hiring somebody in a customer service position and that person's deaf, and that person would need a full-time interpreter in order to do their job, that's hiring two people to do the same job. If I have an employee who their job does not require constant communication and they are able to accommodate through use of typing or other kinds of things that they have to communicate with their coworkers and things of that nature, they don't have a lot of direct public access and things of that nature, but they need a sign language interpreter during meetings and things of that nature, that would be a different consideration. That's not hiring two people to do the same job, that's accommodating the communication for that person in those particular situations. So it's a different evaluation or different determination. Braille services for somebody, captioning if there's going to be a lot of videos or anything that that person would be needing to use as part of their job. Again, bringing in a specialist who might have a specialization in ergonomics for a worksite evaluation. I already talked about the reassignment issue a little bit earlier in here. Again, looking at whether there's an equivalent position available and offering that to the person. They do not have to be the most qualified for the position, but they do have to be qualified. And then it's their choice as to whether or not they choose to take that particular position. When an accommodation does not work, again, the process is interactive, which means we go back to the table, we look at other options, see what might happen. If what we're offering somebody says no to, then we go through the termination process because now I'm not a qualified person because I'm not using the accommodation, I'm not accepting the accommodation that would be used. So I would do whatever I would do when I terminate anybody in that regard. I did want to leave some time for questions because we promised that we'd have you out of here in an hour and a half max. So are there any additional questions or something that I did not respond to? I know this is a lot of information in a short period of time.
You talked earlier about the ADA is the minimum
Well, you definitely have to look at, you have to look at your setting precedents. If you're demonstrating that you are doing things above and beyond, then you would have to treat everybody equally in that context. So we have to be really careful. Sometimes we'll see companies will do something for a CEO that they won't do for a line staff person. That puts them in jeopardy of that particular situation, for sure. Yeah, because it's not about my ranking, it's about whether or not that's something that is reasonable for you. If you've demonstrated that it's reasonable, you know, in the context, then that would put you in that situation for sure. Other questions? I know nobody wants to ask any because you think you'll get out early.
Since you work in county, is it a reasonable accommodation if one of my truck drivers can't do the work at the highway department, that they could get accommodated in the clerk's office doing something?
Reassignment goes across the entire county. It's not just within the department for which I currently work. So if there is a position available anywhere in the county, it would be my responsibility to look at whether or not there were other positions available, not just in my unit. When I'm looking at ADA obligations, I'm looking at them from the totality of the entire county.
So does that go with the units are not the most qualified, if they are qualified?
If they're qualified. Yep. Now, if you have any union, are you a union shop at all? Okay. So obviously then, of course, that club comes into play because qualifications also could include qualified within the union. So there could be positions that have certain seniority requirements and things associated with them. Those would be part of the qualifications for the position. Of course, those things can always be negotiated with the union. The union has to be on at the table as well, as the union is part of the employment process and it has liability under the ADA. But definitely you have to look at qualifications across the board in that regard. The ADA has been held up many times against the bargaining, laws and things of that nature, and the bargaining laws for qualifications, they trump the ADA in that regard. But it's been very clear to be said that the bargaining unit is responsible under the ADA, the same as the employer is responsible under the ADA, because they control conditions of employment, and thus they have to be at the table in regards to what might be reasonable from an accommodation perspective. Other questions? Great. Well, thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.